One day my grandfather told me a story I'd remember for the rest of my life. I was 11 years old, and it was clearly not something to tell a child of that age. It's a story with disturbing roots and a morbid ending. My grandfather lived through its beginning, and I witnessed its end. He was born in Spain in the late 20s. When it all began, he was 10 years old. The village where he was born was lost in the Maquis. There wasn't much traffic then, and even less now, as the village has since been abandoned. It wasn't on any major road, nor was it close to any major town. It was a sad place, a place where children's dreams and ambitions died, stifled by tradition and almost total isolation. But there was one among them who didn't see things the same way. His father had intended him, like many others in the village, to succeed him as winemaker. But the boy dreamed of playing the flute in a big orchestra. He could see himself playing in front of hundreds of people in Madrid or Barcelona. He'd had this dream ever since he unearthed an old wooden flute in his attic, an instrument so damaged that the child had been astonished to make a sound the first time he blew into it. His father didn't take kindly to this new hobby, as all the time his son spent extracting sounds from his ridiculous instrument was a waste of time. Instead, he should have learned the various techniques of cutting grapes or the methods of lifting and stapling. Besides, how could a penniless artist look after his father when the latter was inevitably caught up with age? Hiding from his father's disapproving gaze, the boy began to play in secret. But in the village, the walls had ears, and the distinctive sound of his flute did not go unnoticed. So, when the mood took him, he would leave the little stone houses behind and head off into the garrigue. He walked for long stretches, over ravines and crevasses, up and down hills. Only when he reached his hiding place did he stop, in front of the big stone. It was a huge piece of reddish rock, seemingly placed there by a gigantic, divine hand. The boy would always sit on the same old tree stump and, after looking over his shoulder, play his flute without worrying whether anyone was listening or not. At first, the notes were hesitant. The sounds coming out of the little wooden instrument were shrill and tremulous. But the more the child came to sit facing the stone, the more the days passed, and the better he played his little flute. Soon he was able to create increasingly complex melodies. One day, while he was playing as usual, a raven as black as night landed on the big stone. The boy stopped playing and observed the bird. This time, the boy had an audience. He began to play again, and at the end of his recital, gave the raven a low bow before leaving. While there was talk of civil war and disappearances in the village, the boy spent his afternoons sitting on the stump in front of the big stone. The raven was always there to watch the show. The boy played for him as if he were the president himself, and soon a second raven landed alongside the first. Then a third, followed by a fourth. After several weeks, no less than 40 ravens were landing on the big stone every day. Occasionally, the birds even arrived before he did. The boy would then take to the stage, greeting his audience. But with time, his concerts became rarer. His father forbade him to go out in the late afternoon and ordered him to stay away from the big red stone. Then, finally, he forbade him to go out at all. People were disappearing from the village. The baker had vanished, followed by the miller. People who spoke too loudly, according to the boy's father. Other residents had left without explanation. Respectable people, well established in the village, moved away overnight. The sweet sound of the flute, the melodies, the fresh air, all these things the boy missed as he moped by the window. And so, a month later, when more villagers had disappeared, the little boy took advantage of his father's heavy sleep to slip away. Night was slowly falling, and many of the houses were now unoccupied. The story goes that when the boy arrived not far from the great stone, he saw light and hundreds of crows flying in a circle around the place. The remaining inhabitants of the village, though few in number, recounted hearing a terrible, dry noise. Like a titanic whip, it echoed throughout the valley. It was also said that an atrocious smell could be smelled throughout the village, even inside the houses. Whatever happened to the child, he never returned from his twilight walk. My grandfather always assured me that this little boy was his brother, even though my father was certain that he knew of no uncle who had died as a child. And for a long time in my life, I wondered why he'd told me this story when I was so young. Perhaps it was some kind of morality tale to put into my head the idea of not straying too far from home. In any case, it had an effect. I never went out alone for very long, and always in the vicinity of the property. After that, I almost forgot about it, until my grandfather died. Out of curiosity, I looked up his home village. I couldn't find anything about a legend of a child playing the flute to the crows, but I did discover something much sadder. The village, when my grandfather was a child there, had been torn apart by the Spanish Civil War. Many of the inhabitants didn't support Franco's regime, and some even openly advocated it. Nationalist troops stationed in the area regularly raided the village to remove any inhabitants who were too vocal in their support for the Republicans, suspecting them of aiding them in their rout. For a long time, the descendants of those who disappeared were unaware of their forebears' fate. They had vanished without a trace, carried off by the fascists. Had they been taken to concentration camps? Had they been shot? Where were their bodies? Questions that remained unanswered for a long time. But a few years ago, these families got together to urge the Spanish government to look into their case. Their search uncovered a mass grave, not far from a huge red stone, containing 28 bodies, most of them charred. All had been shot in the head or neck. There was only one corpse whose bones had remained intact. According to the investigators, it had been killed well after the others and had not been burned like them. It was a child's skeleton, also with a bullet mark between the eyes. What finally convinced me of the truth of my grandfather's story was the object the child was holding in his still clenched hand. A small, wooden flute.